I would like to know what games you brought.
The watch
Aha, we've got the
by
watch. Anyone else?
Anna
Uh-huh.
Uh, Masks.
Masks.
Mask.
Excellent. Okay.
The one that I have that I came close to trying to run once is Sagas of the Ashlayers.
Aha.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Herman, what did you bring?
I got Dungeon World.
Dungeon World. Excellent. Also rounding things out. Now, unsurprisingly, the perspicacious among you have figured out that I have brought, guess what? Apocalypse World. That's why none of you could do it. I own Worldwide Wrestling and Monster Hearts. I was a playtester on Worldwide Wrestling. I also own, but I am less familiar with, Apillion and Headspace. So the one Apocalypse game that I feel really, really bad for not knowing at all is Diaspora. Repeatedly mentioned to me as notable for different reasons, but I'd really like to find out. All right, so if we look, we have a two-part process because this is like a lab, right? And I'm not yet prepared enough to send you the protocol before we do this, but that's how I plan to do it in the future. Tonight, you have to bear with me. Part 1 out of Part 2. Possibly Part 3. But Part 1 is this. We take a look at that thing I just sent, and you can see that it's just this simple horizontal chart. And the first thing if you go from left to right, you'll see that it'll start with something that's called fixed, and then each column proceeds into more and more and more customizable content. So the example I always give is with Trollbabe. Your character is a Trollbabe. Done. And she's female. Done. There's just no argument. You can't say, well, I want to play a farmer guy or I want to play a troll. No, forget it. You're playing this. Any number of things can be fixed. Setting is a good example. If you're going to be playing, we all know, yes, you can play Hero Quest using anything, blah, blah, blah. But it's written for Glorantha. It's developed in the context of Glorantha. Most of the time, if you're going to be playing Hero Quest, you're going to be using Glorantha. I'm not saying it's absolutely fixed because whatever you do at the table is whatever you do, but in many games there are things that are fixed. So the first thing is to think about anything in your game which is fixed. That's not the same as things that are designated that you choose among or you roll among. That's next. So you kind of so in that case that would be in Apocalypse World, for example, the only thing that's fixed in Apocalypse World is a question, which is what destroyed the old world. It's not an answer. It's just fixed that question exists. That something destroyed the old world in every imaginable way, at every level of reality you can possibly imagine, and we don't know what it is. That's just known. Then a good example of things that are fixed but you choose among, so would be the skins in Apocalypse World. One of the interesting things about the skins in Apocalypse World is that they are absolutely fixed in play. There is no other hardholder. If you pick hardholder, you're the hardholder. Even somebody who qualifies for that in the fiction is not considered a hardholder the way you are. So okay. So can you guys give an idea of what you're seeing across those charts? Or I don't think it's going to be the same for every game. That's why I'm doing this. I'm trying to show that conceptually, or at least investigate whether conceptually these things are organized from the ground up in exactly the same ways. There are some things that you just make up. You don't even have to make up, but you just do. Notice that in Apocalypse World, and it may not be the case for some of your games, but in Apocalypse World, even the names are chosen from a set of options. I'm going to leave out the fact that you can wave your hands and say, oh, but you can make up your own name. I know. I'm talking about the way you basically play it and without all of the ifs and buts. So, what do you guys see in your games that's absolutely fixed? Note the difference between the idea of a setting, like apocalyptic, versus a real fixed setting, a land with a name, potentially with a map, and with all sorts of properties. Because you don't have that in Apocalypse World. In Apocalypse World, the actual setting is all the way over to the right. Completely customizable.
Yeah, it looks like I think Sagas of the Icelanders is, what's fixed is you are playing the stories of the early settlers of Iceland.
Right. So it's a much more fixed setting. There is one Iceland. It's not, or a literary Iceland. I get that. But it's certainly not, this is a Nordic game. You could set it in a fantasy Nordic land or a space fiction Nordic land or any of the Nordic lands, and you can pick or anything like that. It's there. So you got a fixed setting. Whereas Herman, I think Dungeon World presents a sort of an interesting idea. Do you see it as having a fixed setting or an idea for a setting that's customizable or made up otherwise?
It's more customizable. It's more like you have a fantasy setting, and it is a fantasy setting,
right?
But not a particular one. There have been a couple of people who have done specific settings for it, but it's the game itself that doesn't prescribe or have a fixed setting as such.
So the
Except for
fixed
the fact that you have
right.
You have a magic, and there is a magic user and a etc.
Right. So there's situational aspects of fantasy which are fixed, which are given, but not a given fantasy world with a name.
No.
Now, what's kind of interesting about this is the concept of D&D fantasy, which developed through the course of the 80s and fantasy fiction and gaming of the 80s to create a genre that had not previously existed. And in many ways, Dungeon World is operating off of that set of concepts.
Yes.
So you could be, for example, we could take some of the 1980s fantasy series, Raymond Feist's Magician series, or I'll name a few of my least favorite, which isn't very nice, but the Iron Tower trilogy, the Belgariad, and any number of these. Yes, I know, Gordon, but there's good ones too. But the point is that they're all written basically as D&D fantasy, and no matter how complicated the map, they're all pretty much the same concept of what the characters are there for, what they're like, what fantasy is like, what you can expect in terms of races and magic and stuff like that. So Dungeon World is interesting in that there's no fixed setting, but there's things about the setting which are very, very fixed.
Yeah, I've heard Adam Cole talk about how when they were investigating Dungeon World and D&D, they realized that D&D was its own genre, and that not like any other fantasy genre, it was also its own thing.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, what about for the Watch?
So there's two things that I think are pretty fixed. One is that player characters are always non-male. They could be either female or non-binary, but they cannot be cisgender male. And the other thing is that the setting mostly is kind of like dark fantasy generally, but there's like a few fixed elements that are more concrete, like it's a land in which there's like a few clans that are named and that have some characteristics with vary depending on the game. And there's also like the idea that this land was invaded by the Shadow, and that changed things. And clans and the Shadow, I think the parts of the setting that are more fixed.
Excellent. Okay. And Ross?
Yes, Masks. Masks has a defined setting.
Mm-hmm.
Halcyon City
which is a superhero comic style city with a specific fat history in terms of generations of superheroes. So it situates the team heroes it's about very much as a fourth generation with potentially, ancestors and parents who are heroes and things like that.
Santiago, hello. Now, what Apocalypse Engine game have you brought?
I have both Monster Hearts 1 and 2.
Fantastic. All right, that really rounds it out. Very high on my list to play.
It's my favorite game. I'm running it this week.
Ah, excellent. We were just going through some of the things that are fixed for the game. And for Monster Hearts, it's kind of interesting. Tell me, put it in your own words. Is there a fixed setting or anything else that's absolutely non-negotiably the case about the game? I mean, about the content.
Well, not really, but because at the end there are some options, but actually it's mainly for playing teenagers in high school. And
right.
In the second edition, that gets stronger because you are told to put them in the same classroom in the first scene. So that's a pretty fixed thing, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a very good example, too, because as you guys can see across these games, the concept of setting versus not setting is extremely fluid, or there's quite a spectrum there. All the way from what we think of as a canonical setting for a game, all the way to almost completely customizable, make it up, which actually Apocalypse World is the closest to, I think, of all of them. So, and then the others are all various things in between, with different degrees of what's fixed, but it's always something. Let's move to the next column, and I don't want to spend all night on this diagram, but I want you guys to think about how these, just looking at the very first column, the games are not the same. So in the next one, which, remind me, I'm afraid to click away from my screen right now that I'm recording, so remind me what the second column is.
Chosen?
Right, so you have options that are explicit. And you choose among them. Now, choosing. In some ways, you could include a random version as, you can say chosen versus random in this one column if you wanted to. Because those are just really two ways to choose, basically. Herman, in Dungeon World, I think for all of these, correct me anybody if I'm wrong, but I think for all of these, the skins are in this category. They're fixed, and you get one. And I don't care if the organizer of the game passes them out at random. I don't care if you, carefully discuss and negotiate who gets to be who, or anything like that. Or if I don't know. Anyway, you get one. I don't care. But the point is that not everybody is the same, and that everybody gets one from this list. In Apocalypse World, the same thing goes for the moves. There's more moves for your skin than you get to start, and I'm pretty sure that's similar for all of yours, unless something's different about that.
Yeah, it's the same for Dungeon World.
Same for Dungeon World. And I think Monster Hearts is the same, right, Santiago?
Yeah, it's totally about skins.
Right. So the skin, a lot of things in these games are very similar for this feature. There's a lot of lists. There's a lot of choosing from the lists. You choose a skin from a list. You choose your moves from a list. In many cases, at least in Apocalypse World and in Monster Hearts, you choose a name from the list. In Worldwide Wrestling, you don't really choose a name. Your wrestler is much more your creation in Worldwide Wrestling. There's suggestions and a lot more customization at the personal level, I think. But in Apocalypse World, it's pretty straightforward. Negotiated free will aside, you're pretty much picking from what's right there in front of you. So is there anything else about that? I don't think do any of them have random elements at this point?
No.
Right? You don't roll for which move you get or roll for anything like that. And
you choose a stat or decide which stats strength,
right?
Etc. Or where, but there's a fixed array of stats.
Unlike many games, you don't even roll for your attributes, because the 4 attributes are in the games I know anyway. They're really not very different from what you find in most role-playing games. And they're not supposed to be. I'm not saying that's a criticism. But you, in fact, we might even have a little fun with it. This is a bit redundant, but we can do it anyway. It's kind of fun. In Apocalypse World, I said 4, I meant 5. Cool, hard, hot, sharp, weird. What are they in Masks?
Oh, in Masks, they are Danger, Freak, Savior, Superior, and Mundane.
Interesting. That's actually a very interesting batch. It's very different from the batch in Apocalypse World. They mean different things.
Yes,
right.
They're very much about being a teenager versus being a superhero, and they're much more of a focus.
Right.
The games, they go up and down quite a lot.
They are not supposed to measure kind of your ability or your powerness. It's more about how you see yourself, how other people see yourself.
Right. No, it's an important point. What do these things actually represent besides just their names? As a unit, what do they represent? And so let's see. Gordon, I'm curious about this because I don't know the answer to this at all.
Oh, they're really exciting.
Dungeon World.
Dungeon World has the classic 6 stats of D&D. So strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, charisma, and you derive a plus 1, plus 2, the usual stats.
Right.
The classic scores like 16 or 15, things like that.
I see. Interesting. But the dice, just to jump ahead a little bit, the dice in Dungeon World, though, you're still rolling the 2d6 and looking for 7 to 9 and 10 to 10 plus, right?
Yes.
Right. So.
That's like you get into like plus 1s and 2s and 3s again.
Aha. So, let's see here. Who are we missing?
Me.
That's right. Monster Hearts.
What?
Yeah, well, the ones I can remember while on foot are hot, cold, volatile, I don't know how you pronounce it.
Right.
And there was one more, I think.
Right, there was one that was the opposite of volatile. But you're right. There's just the 4, I think.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I remember they are 4. I'm not sure, but that's what I remember right now.
Yeah. Well, the ghoul that I made up that I'm still demanding to play. That's why I never run Monster Hearts. I want to play it. So,
run games on Monster Hearts demand like on a Saturday night with like minutes of time to prepare. So just call me.
Okay. Angel, what about the Watch?
The Watch. There are 4. There are Cunning, Training, and Valor.
Aha. Okay. Tell us about Sagas of the Icelanders for the attributes.
Yeah, and so what we have is young, versed, gendered, and weird. WYRD. Right,
which will only make sense, yeah. So what we're seeing, first of all, is that they've got slightly different numbers, and there's a couple of different concepts. Many of them are pretty similar. Monster Hearts, Apocalypse World, perhaps a couple of others. They're not that different from sort of high impact, your ability to deliver high impact of a specific kind. And everybody's got them. But it's kind of like, okay, you can hit this hard with your, with your cold, and you can hit this hard with your cold. Dungeon World seems a little different.
Yes, it's sort of like very much based or inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, of course.
Right.
Which makes the stats work a little differently. And there's some uses for the bear stats, so like your hit points. You have hit points, like in D&D, your hit point is Constitution and not Con.
Right.
+1 or -1, and your Constitution is 15 or 8 or something like that.
I'm not sure that there's such a thing as a direct conversion between the two. You'll have to tell us whether you think it's a cosmetic interaction between the D&D concepts and the engine, or the other mechanisms. It's kind of a good question. The other thing I was going to say is this: we're not going to work our way through this whole diagram, but what I do want everybody to think about is, what would your game look like through the rest of it? So what are some things that you, for example, just completely make up, either about your character or about play in general? Perhaps it's something that it's designated for you to make up. Like in many fantasy role-playing games, there's just a line that says name. So you see, you're supposed to make up a name. Providing lists for that kind of thing is possible, but in many of the older games that was not the case. It didn't give you a list of names. You just made one up. Another good example would be stuff like, hair color, eye color. There it is. It's just a line on the sheet. You fill it in. Sometimes land of origin was the same way. It didn't make any difference for anything else. It wasn't a step in character creation. It was just something you filled out on the sheet. And it didn't even matter what it was. You could make up the name of anywhere and just write it in. So think about those things. And then also, this is a lot vaguer, think about things that you can make up, but it's not designated that you should. And that's a very weird category. It's things that people often will make up for characters in this game, or make up for settings or situations in this game, but are not actually mentioned in the process. So this little way of looking across games with this little chart, you can often find that games you thought were the same are very different, and games you thought were different were very much the same. In the case of this, if we were to take Apocalypse World, you would find nearly everything in the game is taken from those lists. But guess what is designated all the way at the other end? And it's not even specified that anyone has to make it up. It's just made up when and if the game master wants to. And it is the answer to the question: how and why was the world destroyed? The heart of the Maelstrom. And in my opinion, it's very strongly implied that that is there to be done, partly because characters will be peering into the Maelstrom and apparently, finding out more and more about what destroyed the world. But you'll notice that in Apocalypse World, one of the most important aspects of play is completely made up, and it's not made up in a designated, specified way. There is no GM sheet to fill out that will arrive at what destroyed the world and why. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's sometimes that thing I was talking about, you might think it's kind of trivial. Who cares what color my character's hair is? There's nothing even on the sheet that says hair color, but this one player, is really big on how his character is red-haired. It's a big thing for this player. There is nothing in the game, nothing on the sheet, nothing that ever goes anywhere near that. And in that sense, you might say, well, that's just that player's quirk. But in the case of Apocalypse World, it's not a quirk at all. It's actually a really big deal. And yet it is 100% unconstructed opinion by one person. So, you see what I'm getting at? I mean, that's what's all the way on the far end.
Yeah.
So, it's kind of, think about it. I can't think of very much in Apocalypse World which is in that kind of toward the ends, but not all the way. Most everything is on the lists. What about for your games? We're going to leave this section of this particular exercise in a minute, but can you look across it and think about your profile of your game? Where does most of it pile up?
Yeah, definitely mostly piles up on picking from lists and deciding on, limited number of choices from lists, and there's stuff about appearance that you do that with. There clearly are things that are just not there at all, and you can make up, like as you just mentioned, but the vast majority of everything in the book is picked from the list. Right.
That's the case in my experience with Apocalypse World, Monster Hearts, and several others. In Worldwide Wrestling, that presents a really interesting difference. You do pick what kind of wrestling franchise you're talking about, although usually you start kind of small. Because it's more fun to watch your franchise get more famous. But the interesting thing about it is that absolutely nothing designates the theme or the shtick of the franchise as a whole. Nothing says we're the tough franchise, we're the family franchise, we're the Christian one, we're the biker one, right? Nothing, no, we're the Euro one, anything like that. No, none of them do that. They're all, it's very clear that when you make a franchise in the game that all of your wrestlers belong to, it's very clear that, because they do, you can't play wrestlers that are in different leagues or something. You have to be in that one designated stable for a given, team. I guess stable is the right word. And the important thing, though, is that nothing in the game designates what it's like. Which is enormous. It's enormous in play. You can't play without it. But it's there to be made up, and nothing says you're supposed to make it up. I'm not saying those are omissions. In many of these games, such things are left to be emergent properties. And in fact, I think in both of the games I just mentioned, Apocalypse World and Worldwide Wrestling, they work as emergent properties. Yeah.
What does the wrestling game? What sticks on that game? If that is the franchise is open.
The franchise is open in terms of how big it is, which is to say how rich and how many people watch it. So, and as I say, most times I've seen it played, and when we played, we started near the lower end. Because, like I said, it's fun to watch it grow or to have characters who want it to grow. But you don't have to. But that is that you choose that.
And what is established about the franchise then?
Well, frankly, not very much. I mean, mechanically, not very much. Mechanically, it's more about how it's narrated. If you get more popular, what does that mean? If you're this kind of franchise, it simply means that the cable show isn't going to be canceled. But if you are in some enormous rich franchise, then becoming more popular means you get to go to, you know, the great big all world, you know, championship bout or something. It also sort of implies how much your wrestler is paid in terms of scale. So if you're a popular wrestler at one level, you've got a sort of celebrity lifestyle. Whereas at another level, you could have the same degree of fame, but, you know, that just means that you can make your rent on your trailer. So Herman, this is kind of interesting for your case. Are there things that in Dungeon World that seem to go down toward the right end of that chart?
Not much on the player side of things. Though of course you have free choice of how to play your character. If I look at the right side, I think for the Game Master there's the draw maps to leave blanks kind of thing, where you do the world creation, bouncing off ideas from your players, and building or doing not too much prep for your world. A bit like Apocalypse World as well, I think.
Right. Apocalypse World is kind of interesting in that there's a lot open. Do you have mutants with animal heads in Apocalypse World or not? Do you have, you know, is it full of ruined cities, or is it, you know, all radioactive glass sand? Apocalypse World is surprisingly loose in this. It's got an idea, and then, at least, maybe I'm wrong about this, but my experience with it is that a lot of it is very customized by the game master in terms of choosing hazards, fronts, right? When you color up your front and say this is what it looks like, that can be extraordinarily different from game to game to game. What about the watch?
So before that, one thing in Dungeon World that I think is kind of like that is the concept of dungeon itself, because there's not Dungeon World is open to the idea that a dungeon can be anything.
Right.
It doesn't have to be like a physical place under the earth or anything like that. I think it's interesting. For the watch, I think there's a lot of questions. For example, when a player chooses his own their clan, the clan they belong to, they get to answer 2 questions about it.
Right.
Questions are pretty are charged questions, are loaded questions.
But they're not lists. You actually make it up.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I guess the nature of the shadow is also pretty open.
Right.
And that's like a lot of things that the MC initially list. Like that's pretty much a list, like a few objectives for the shadow, a few manifestations, but the more concrete things are open to that. But there's nothing to the point of Apocalypse World, that kind of implied question that is not even spoken in the world, in the text.
Right. So I don't mean to step on anybody. Anyone else have comments along these lines?
Yes. In Masks, I think there's a question it points to, which is what does it mean to be a hero?
Right.
And how do you grow up to be a hero? And how do you become a hero? Which is kind of pointed to by things like the labels, but I don't think it sort of gets answered until you answer it through playing in terms of what your characters do and how they respond to things within this.
Yeah, and that's very interesting, because that answer is individual to each player. They have to answer what it means to be a hero for themselves.
And they put themselves in positions where they drive to say, I think it's like this, and therefore I will my labels in this direction because heroes need tough or something like that. But then they, other people can influence how that gets shaped as well.
Excellent. So there's a lot of building a moral framework, a heroic framework, a challenge framework through play itself. Again, I'm open to correction. I trust the author of Apocalypse World will probably be critiquing this in due time. And I'm very open to correction about this. But in Apocalypse World, I think the fronts have a tendency to be sort of repetitious, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, but a front just does pressure again. And it may have certain fictional qualities that give it different basic, thematic content, but not really very different. It's pressure on the characters, we see what happens. Pressure on the characters, we see what happens. Pressure on the characters, you see what happens. But really, aside from pure fictional weight, you're not really expecting any kind of shared theme to emerge, some shared thing like what you just described, Ross. You don't really expect or anything like that to build, except possibly for more insight into what was wrong with the world originally. Maybe. That's very amorphous, how that might be connected. It's not even very explicitly stated that that's where all this content might go. Let's look at something a little more important. Did we leave anybody out, really, for thinking about what could be more customizable? Mostly immediately is what we're talking about, really. Not so much what happens later, but immediately. But one thing that's left open, therefore, Ross, if I understand, is the definition of hero. Many superhero games, that's right up front, right? What is a hero?
At the comm system, same level superheroes, which says heroes do this.
Right. Whereas here, that's flatly absent, and I think that's it's a meaningful absence. Gordon, did you think of anything that's?
Well, so I mean, one of the interesting things in Sagas of the Icelanders is there's a very specific. If you're going to be playing this for a long time, here's some questions you should be thinking about,
right?
And not have the answer to.
There you go.
You should have questions about how law change, how do gender roles change, what gets established. There's a whole set of questions that you should pick a couple of and explicitly not have an answer to.
Right. Interesting. We're moving into part 2, just by the way we're talking, about things that will change through play itself. Herman, do you think we left anything out about just what's open, what's not? For example, character names. Are character names a list in Dungeon World?
There's a list on each of the skins.
Okay, so that's more okay.
You can choose another one, but there's a suggested list of character names for.
Excellent. Interesting. Okay, now here's the thing I want to do. What we're going to do for this part 2 is the plan. There. Okay, so part 2 is about change. Now, I'm going to describe what I see in Apocalypse World for change at a very short-term level. And then we're going to compare those. And then we're going to do the same thing for long-term change. Maybe I'll do both for Apocalypse World so you get the idea of the difference. But in Apocalypse World, you're talking about the advances where you fill in the little bubbles and then you get an advance once you fill in your 5th. And advances usually, or most advances, especially to start, are not very surprising. They could be an increase in an attribute. They could be picking a new move. And a couple of other things. So that's one thing, is just what you think of as plain old effectiveness improvement. So that's real straightforward. And there are 2 other things that go with that. One of them is history change, right? The changes in your history with other characters, HX. And in Monster Hearts, you have strings, right? That change, that are similar. And then we'll compare that with other games too. And so then in and there's also the impact of the sex moves, which are fairly specific in terms of those particular details. +1s going forward or changing history, or I'll have to look through some of them. Well, let's see. Why not? Why don't I pick my favorite? Who wants to choose? Who's Ron's favorite skin in Basic Apocalypse World?
Hocus.
Yeah, busted right out of the gate. Busted. Absolutely. First character. In fact, here he is, right here in my copy of Apocalypse World, stuffed here in the skin spot is my Hocus. Brother Bat. And so we're just gonna go and see what happens when what happens when the Hocus gets laid. You each hold 1, and either of you can spend your hold any time to help or interfere with the other, despite any barriers whatsoever. So that's your Hocus sex move. So as you can see, it is a very specialized bonus or penalty, right? And so it exists on that same level as those very minor changes in the character through checking off the little advance bubbles. So sex moves, history changes for a variety of reasons, and the checking off for improvement to get more moves or to increase your scores. So everybody's with me on this, right? It's pretty straightforward, I think. Now I want to contrast that to the long-term changes. What happens after you get 5 advances and what you can do. And in the case of Apocalypse World, some of them are some of them are kind of interesting. You can change your character class. And what that means is that you can start taking moves from other skins. And more importantly, though, you can retire your character. So it's really a binary choice. Each time you do 5 advances, you say, do I want to keep playing this character? If I do I want to keep playing this character pretty much as defined by the skin I've got, just more and more and more of it? Or do I want to change up the very definition of this character? Do I want to break the concept of skins and make this character a much more customized character across the range of options for the whole game? Those of you who are thinking multi-class and stuff like that, you're not far wrong. But the point is that you have a choice. At each one of these sort of plateaus, you can say, do I just want to keep improving, or do I want to branch? And the biggest branch of all is retire. This character is done. This character has reached his or her thematic moment. I maintain that that is related in many ways to whether the game, this particular group, emphasizes the maelstrom or not. If the group has been thoughtful about the maelstrom and its content, then those decisions become much more powerful, is my claim. So Herman, I want to start with you. In Dungeon World, do you see the difference between my basic change, which is very similar to many role-playing games, a little tricky, what with the sex and all, but not too much different, and then this larger scale change about character definition and the ending of a character?
Yeah, the Dungeon World has similar things. You gain levels, as it's a D&D pastiche, if you want to call it that way. And each level you choose a move, extra move from advanced moves. There's a set for level 2 to 5, there's a set from level 6 to 10, which you can choose from as well. There's some multi-classing options in between those. And once you get to level 10, if you get enough XP to get to level 11, you can retire to safety, take on an apprentice, or change entirely to a new class. So there's the big change at the end, if you want to call it that way.
Is there any content like the Maelstrom in Dungeon World?
Not as such. Not a general thing. You can there are moves to, but it's more to spout war or make up backgrounds.
Right.
There's nothing quite like the Maelstrom in
right.
Apocalypse World.
So it's in my mind anyway. It means that even though the options look a little similar, like retire the character, branch out the character, they don't have as much potential thematic content to them.
Yeah,
that's
there is the death move. If you die, you take your last breath move.
Yes.
And and then you stand before the dominion of death, and you might go back from the gates of death and live again. And that's the unknown thing there. But,
right.
Which is not defined in the game as such.
Interesting. Okay. So what about some of the others? Can you contrast the baseline levels? Can you contrast the baseline levels of character change to these sort of larger scale? In fact, Monster Hearts, I really want to start with that because that one's really interesting after Dungeon World.
So in Monster Hearts, it's interesting because as you advance, you gradually get to pick moves from other skins. Not change into another skin, but to pick and choose moves from them. And then later in the game, what you get is new moves related to maturity. Like the one I remember is that you get to replace. Turn someone on, but make someone feel beautiful.
Right. What really interests me about this, you mentioned both of them, of course. One is simply the content, maturity. Everybody's moves in the basic skins are dysfunctional.
Yeah.
All of them. And there's not a good one in the bunch. They all suck emotionally for you as well as for another person. Whereas the mature moves are completely mature. I mean, they're completely developed. They are all about how adults deal with one another, or rather the way our ideal notion of how adults deal with one another, right?
Yeah.
Never mind that. But the point being that that what you said is crucial, though. They replace the other moves. You don't add them. You actually lose the dysfunctional move, and now you have an emotionally and socially functional one in its place.
Yeah, it's a big difference.
Yeah, to me that's actually extremely significant. And so in many ways, this is just my opinion, the whole darkness, wildness, the equivalent of the Maelstrom rule in Monster Hearts, to me seems a little weak because all that craziness is already right there in the characters front and center. So kind of anything they do to me is kind of the Maelstrom equivalent, is really weird and awful. Replacing it with these... Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. As I was reading it these past few days, it surprised me a little that it had a mechanic like the one in Apocalypse World. I think that in Monster Hearts it's called Gaze into the Abyss.
That's right, yeah.
From I think it's a reference to the Nietzsche phrase. And yeah, it does stand out as something a bit weird. Of course, I couldn't fully process it or analyze it mechanically, but
Right. I mean, we'd have to play.
Yeah, of course. But in Apocalypse World, it's about getting in tune with something that is wrong, basically, that is all around the people. And I don't know, in Monster Hearts, it seems to be a lot more about interpersonal drama.
Right.
And their troubles with their problems within themselves, but I'm not sure. It's because I'm not sure where is the abyss in Monster Hearts.
I guess what I'm saying is I see the abyss, but I see it looking at me in every single one of those other attributes and everything else. But that's not really. Maybe I'm going a little off the beam by being too critical. My point, though, is that the maturation moves, those developments, which can only happen later in play. In fact, it's pretty explicit. You actually have to go through a whole season before you can even begin to think about that. And they're pretty significant. I mean, it's a really big deal. It to me, I wouldn't play the game unless those existed. It would be just an exercise in teen misery and nothing else.
Really?
Finding
To you, that is something to strive toward?
I don't know if strive toward is the right way to do it. I think that's a little too pre-programmed. I just like the fact that it's there.
Yeah, I've played Monster Hunter a few times, and a really interesting thing is that in one of the first games we played, we went into a situation where two characters were having a conflict, were getting violent with each other, and they were and some of the characters were like, "What can I do? I want to intervene. How do I stop them?" And they could not.
Right. You don't have any moves to actually make sense. You can only add problems. Yeah.
Yeah, and only one of the moves the only move that lets me do that is a bad move, a mature move.
Right. But okay, so I feel like I'm leaving some people out. We've got a lot of games to talk about. Let's go right through it. Let's find out more about these advanced moves or other things that change only through developed play. Sometimes tangibly, sometimes intangibly. So, anybody?
So, Saga of the Icelanders is kind of interesting because the vast majority of it is just get another move, but they have the role of the child, where once the child fills up his advancements, you move on to a new book. You move on to a new... So there is a interesting transition there.
I was going to point out in Apocalypse World that the mechanic, the hocus, and I think it's the angel, but I have to double check. Not the brainer, but those three and maybe one or two others. Those have really direct vectors straight into the maelstrom, and none of the others do. So the skins are not all alike in the way that they relate to change. When the child takes on basically when the child grows up, does that affect anyone else?
If there was something through the bonds, which is their HX, potentially, but nothing direct.
So there's nothing else when law comes to Iceland, when the society changes, nothing like that. Interesting.
Nothing built in.
Interesting. Whereas in so that's Dungeon World, Sagas, Monster Hearts. I'm real interested in a little bit about the masks. Is there something concrete about the generation of heroism that shifts?
So there's a couple of things. They have similar adult moves to Monster Hearts. So they're not as thematically contrasted. So they're sort of, all the moves in Monster Hearts are awful, and the starting ones in Master not so much. But it does have that. You're an adult now, you can actually negotiate on people rather than
Right.
But a lot of it is focused on taking the stats and being able to control who can change them and freezing individual stats in one place to say I'm a hero, and a hero means being really hard and therefore having a high danger.
Interesting. Okay. So you know what this reminds me of a lot? I'm reminded of the Lee Ditko Spider-Man, and I'm also reminded of the Wolfman Perez Nightwing, Robin to Nightwing. You know, those that's what it kind of reminds me of. The character exists in a certain way. The writer and creators feel strongly that the character needs to grow up, and there's a lot of different influences on how that happens through the course of making the comic.
And again, you do that transforming one playbook into another playbook thing as well.
Right. Those, you know, it's kind of interesting. I find that particular detail. What's the word I want? I mean, it's fun. And when I was playing Brother Bat, you can bet I was reading through various other skins, thinking about what I was going to loot from them. Right? I mean, that's true. But on the other hand, it didn't mean very much. You know?
Yeah, I think they've thrown a lot of things into masks, and some of it is we're doing superheroes. So yeah, it's cool if you can turn your superhero. I don't know, brain regenerating, coming back with all telepathic powers instead of being telepathic or something like that.
Right.
But I think some of them are more directed at what it's really trying to about, and some are just it's superhero, but it's superhero thing.
Right.
Right. Quite a lot of rules and quite a lot of things thrown together. They're not always as thematically powerful. But they're only played one shot, so I don't know how it will play out in reality.
Well, that's something I think. I mean, we've got a few very experienced people here about Apocalypse games, and others not so much. That's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, because actually, the thing I see looking at Sagas of Icelanders, there is advancement that just happens when you survive a winter in Iceland.
Right.
That's where you could actually change your role or retire the character
right.
or create a new character or anything like that. That's not actually on the playbook itself. That just happens as winters move on in Iceland.
Interesting. What about the watch? Because that really strikes me as kind of important. And also, do we find out more about the shadow? You know, is there something more built in about that?
Yeah, absolutely. This game is very concrete in that. So on the short term, is very typical. It has like you can advance stats. So on the short term, most of the basic stuff, advancing stats, advancing moves, that are more like about your character, and also camaraderie, which is a value like a currency that you get with other characters that allow you to help them and be helped by them. But there's also jaded moves. Jaded is a value that you mark similarly to experience, social experience, that reflects how kind of affected are you by the fight with the shadow. Basically, how hard, warm, how hard you have had to become as a result of fighting with the shadow. This is like becoming more of I'm hitting myself with echo spray.
No, I understand how disillusioned you are, how tired you are, how morally weary you are. Yeah. So jaded is the thing for
the awareness,
the watch,
basically.
Right.
And as you get marked jaded, the same as experience, when you mark like a certain number of jaded, you gain a jaded moves that are very powerful. They represent that you have become more your awareness and the way the fight with the shadow has affected you. But by using them, you gain more jaded. And if you basically mark all the moves in jaded, the last one is that your character has become too affected by the shadow, has become too affected by the fight, and you are either abandon the fight, come to the shadow, or something like that.
I think this variable is incredibly different across all the games.
Yeah.
This is the one thing that really makes each one of the games, in my experience, and also in my, I'm being a little presumptuous because I haven't played them all by a long shot, but in general, I think this is, to me, the heart of each game. And the fact that they all share the same way to roll 2 dice and to read them, even though, by the way, 7 to 9 is not the same in all of these games. We didn't talk about that, but they're not all the same thing. But numerically they are. And the basic fact that most of them are list-driven, not everything, but at first glance they seem list-driven, can lead you to the idea that these all have the same system. And I'm going to argue that those are actually not systems, those are details, those are certain techniques. But that these larger features of system, these larger cycles of change, and what they mean relative to the questions that were raised in the beginning, those are very different from one another.
Yeah.
So, Herman, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, especially for Dungeon World, I think.
Yeah, it's very much. Dungeon World is very much a lot better to Dungeons and Dragons with a skin of.
Right, you just keep going. Yeah.
I think that there was another guy talking about Dungeon World, but I want to say something afterwards before we move on to another topic.
About Dungeon World? So, let's see. What I want to get at this point is this notion of these larger changes. They can be changes in the world itself, and the one that I have in mind for that is Headspace. In Headspace, the relationship of these big corporations to your resistant cell, to the populace in general, all of those undergo significant change as you continue through play. So basically, it's a political story. The actual policies of resistance and oppression, communication and messaging, all of those things are developing as you go. Whereas in Apillion, which is kind of an interesting contrast, in Apillion you've got the beginning and the middle and the end of the dragons, basically this little clutch of dragons, basically fighting the darkness. And there's no real structure to that. It's not as though they get this many moves and then they take darkness. No, this many advancements and then they take darkness moves or fighting the darkness moves or anything like that. It's all up to the GM. And it's pretty much fixed that they're going to go through this. Apillion, in my opinion, is very much a GM-led story. And you play your dragon and have fights, and you become a big dragon in the context of that story. And then you fight the darkness at the end when it seems like the right time to do it, and you beat the darkness. It's a given. You beat the darkness. That's not really up in... It's very fixed. And in my opinion, of all the Apocalypse games that I've read, designated as such, it's the one that is just laid down. You play your character in it, and you enjoy being in it, and that's it. That's that.
In the watch, it's interesting because there's also like a end game. There's like a list of missions divided in 3 stages. In each stage, there's a few missions, like a number of missions you have to complete, and then you do the final mission of that stage, and then the darkness changes. The MC decides a few new things about the darkness, and then you go to the next stage and the next stage until you get to the final battle, and that's where you fight the darkness and you defeat it. One interesting thing is that as you advance, your character can advance its rank, and you can advance. You can get to the point where you decide which mission you are going to do next.
Right.
Before that, the GM, through like some NPC, tells you that as you advance, you get to say, "We are going to do this mission."
Right. That's kind of interesting. How many of these are, for lack of a better word, truly fixed structures of play, and which games don't have them at all? Apocalypse World doesn't really have very much of that at all. You know, the overarching kind of, you know, saga with its conclusions and things like that. In my opinion, that sort of thing develops through a sense of personal satisfaction. I don't know if this really happens in many groups. My hope is that it would happen through a sense of personal catharsis about what we think is wrong with the actual world that we live in. I mean, I have very idealistic notions about Apocalypse World in play. My idealistic notion is that it's a lot like the better 70s apocalypse movies, where what you're seeing in the apocalyptic setting is really a very pointed critique of our actual modern life. Mm-hmm. And so, in many ways, you know, I'm thinking of A Boy and His Dog and similar things that are very brutal about what was wrong. You don't idealize, people might idealize the world before the bombs fell, but those of us sitting in it watching the movie, we're not idealizing our lives right here, right now at all. Mm-hmm. And so, so to me, that's kind of where, you know, Apocalypse World gets a lot of its push for me. And so looking into the Maelstrom, the various things that become plot relevant because somebody did that, all of that is important to me and would play a role in when I thought I wanted to expand or retire my character. But as I say, it's kind of an idealistic point of view, but it's very emergent. There's no structure at all for that. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Apillion, you don't have that kind of character development that pushes anything. You become more powerful. And Herman, if I'm not mistaking it, it's similar. There's no real, there's character development that becomes richer. Characters form bonds with one another, right?
Yeah.
But, right, go ahead.
Yeah. There's the idea that you organize as a game master, your stories in adventure fronts and have an overarching campaign front.
Right.
But it's not set. The game doesn't end when you end the campaign. The campaign or solve the campaign front. There's no set progression from start to finish.
Right.
It's just like it's a good D&D campaign, and we have another one.
Go ahead with the watch.
About Dungeon World again, Adam Koebel said that while he was analyzing D&D, they came to the conclusion that D&D to him was about attaining or gaining more agency on the world, and try to reflect that. On the watch, yeah, there's like a very fixed structure. On the mission on every session, there's like a mission structure. You go on a mission. You don't really play out what happens in the mission. You play more like the consequences, and then you spend the rest of the session dealing with the consequences. And then you go on another mission, and you go up and up in different phases until you defeat the darkness.
Right. Interesting. Whereas in Masks, how structured is that progression? Or actually, is there one? You mean the one you described already about becoming a more kind of fixed and defined hero with new moves, you know, kind of grown-up moves, if you will.
Yeah, I don't think it's really structured. Apart from there's a bit of you have to take so many advances at the first level before you can take some of the later ones.
Right.
But in terms of how things progress or what happens, you kind of do superhero adventure things and use villains and heroes to put pressure on your actual heroes to sort of see how they respond. But I don't think it's structured in any particular way to build towards a sort of story conclusion or push.
Okay, I think that we've got a pretty good set of contrasts across the games then, in many ways. One is structure, the other is content. How much structure, how much content. They're not the same things, and each game is pretty different in just what that is. I want to focus on one last thing about this. Adversity, the actual identity of individuals that you are battling or defeating. I want to contrast Sagas of the Icelanders with, say, the Watch. Right? In Sagas of the Icelanders, you have who are the adversaries? Who do you fight? Who do you combat? What's the source of the adversity?
Well, so I mean, Sagas definitely allows for the adversity. Could be the characters coming into conflict themselves.
That struck me as quite likely, in fact.
Yeah, and there are certainly lots of prompts for the MC to create crises in the community that the characters need to deal with. It could depend on which characters are getting played. Certainly, some of the role books are much more problematic than others. You know,
right.
You've got a monster or an outsider. You inherently have somebody who is outside the social structure, so that's going to create its own pressures. But it really mostly seems to be about dealing with the issues and the problems that arise within the community itself.
Now, in the case of Dungeon World, we've got a big contrast, right, in terms of the adversity compared to Sagas of the Icelanders.
Yeah. Dungeon World just has all the monsters and the classic D&D opponents, as well as, of course, the humans, the other players in the world, to say.
Right, but the idea basically is that they are foes is probably the best way to put it. Right.
They're foes, and they might be organized in fronts, like organized groups or things like that, where there's not the inherent
right
role in the world for them.
Right. Now contrast that even more so with Monster Hearts. And where's all the adversity in Monster Hearts?
I was saying that in the first edition there were rules for villains that were a little, let's say, odd. That they didn't seem to mesh that well with the rest of the game. And for the second edition, they were revised and almost erased out of the game. Like saying, well, there may appear villains, but don't worry about it too much.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah, it's funny. It's kind of weird. It's almost as though Avery realized, what do we need the villains for? They're just, we've got each other. Right.
Yeah.
The feeling like that was that on the first edition, that they have all these different sources and inspirations.
Right.
And that for the first one, they moved away. How do you say? They moved more and more away from Buffy and those style of of story.
Right.
Like Schreier thinking, all right, you know what? This is similar, but this is not for doing Buffy.
I've played both editions, and it's true that in first edition, villains tended to take first stage and become like the center of, we have to defeat the villain, and that was kind of odd, and I think Avery took that for a very good reason. There's like threats, but they are more like transient.
Right.
And like at the end, they're just like another kind of threat that like puts pressure on the group, but it's not the center stage.
Got it. Ross, in your case, this is interesting. Where do the supervillains come from?
Supervillains. They're I think in terms of adversity, you kind of you have supervillains doing supervillainy things, but I think as much of the adversity is supposed to come from heroes from previous generations. How you're supposed to be a hero.
Wow, how Teen Titans can you get?
And supervillains who put the same sort of pressure, the sort of, I'll tempt you into the dark side.
Right.
there's a lot about making villains that work like that.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so are you guys kind of seeing how I'm trying to contrast these? The thing that I wanted to get across somehow was the idea that if somebody wants to make a game and say it's powered by the apocalypse, they have to think about more than just making a bunch of skins and making a bunch of moves. In a way, that's it's almost deceptive to think of that as a universal engine, those two things I just said. Because really we're talking about character classes, we're talking about a 2d6 roll that's easy to read, and we're talking about specific abilities. And that's it. I mean, there really isn't... And that's not in and of itself.
Had that.
Yeah, we totally did, like as of 1978, right?
Yeah.
So therefore, there's something else going on here, and the question is, looking at these games, I think we're isolating precisely where it is and the potential diversity of how you construct it.
Mm-hmm. I have a question, though. What about moves, especially the idea of the GM having moves? Isn't that something?
Vincent and I argue about this, and he's not here, so maybe it's unfair for me to present this. So formally speaking, I'll splice in a rebuttal from Vincent if he wants right here, okay? But my take is this, that you'll notice that in every single one of these, and I'm thinking really of Apocalypse World, if you do something that isn't covered by a move, what is supposed to happen? You invent a custom move. Right there. So, therefore, you can do anything.
Yeah.
In other words, the moves are only play my character. Really. It's the only move. Now, you have specific things that give you a bonus in a particular way. And some of them are things other people can't do. But how is that different from any character class game where each class has unique things they can do? When it comes to the general idea of do whatever you want, Apocalypse World has it. So it's not a menu of limitations of what your character can do. It's just a bunch of abilities thrown on to the more general ability to do whatever you want.
Yeah, I think.
All right,
if I
what about
right,
this?
Hold on, everybody's got an idea. Gordon Angel Santiago.
Well, the thing that I had heard, I think it was Santiago talking about, was the GM side of that, not the character side of that.
Yeah.
And the thing that I would say to you about that is I think since 1978, you could have thought about what the GM does as the GM making moves, which does not erase the fact that Apocalypse World calling that out and identifying it is very useful and a very good thing to have designers and game masters and everybody looking at and thinking about that. Hey, what you're really doing here is making a move.
Right.
On the other hand, for people who spent decades fighting through that and found a way to solve it, it's less important for them.
Angel.
So in terms of player moves, the thing that is important is that even if you can do anything, when you do something that is not reflected by moves, you can do it, but you don't have kind of the security of that the moves give you. The GM will tell you need to do that, or you cannot. Well, usually not. You cannot do that. It's not often it's done, but like this is going to be the price. Are you sure you want to? Like, there's like the GM has more to say in that aspect. Was when you have a move, you have the capacity of having that agency assured for you, and you know exactly what is going to happen, and the GM has very little say in that case. And moves can be added to that to have agency in like other aspects, but usually like more normally it's like if you do something that's not reflected by any move, the GM tells you, okay, you may be able to do that, but first you need to do that. Or, okay, yeah, sure, but if you do that, this is going to happen. Are you sure?
It's, again, the debate over whether GMs have been doing this anyway the entire time is something I think we can take up in the comments, because it's definitely not an issue. Not an easy issue. Guys, I think we've come to the close, and we need to get going. But Herman, does this seem interesting to you? Did it seem like we talked about anything worthwhile? Or
yeah, I think so. It's good to hear some opinions and some viewpoints on the various games and the various ways to look at it.
Yeah, I appreciate everybody coming. With any luck, this will be the beginning of a big discussion and everything. So, all right, guys, thank you. I'll see you all later.
Thank you.
Right.
See you next time.
Thanks.
Bye.